would never believe what I found. I found a key from a castle that was built over 1,000 years ago. Pretty heavy. Today, we will unlock the door to themes, and I will provide you with all the keys. But before we get started, let's jump into our learning goals. We will analyze plot elements, including rising action, falling action, and resolution. In addition to that, we will infer multiple themes within text using textual evidence. You know, last week, when we looked at traditional tales, we considered the exposition and the rising action. This part of the story, which is the beginning, leads us to the climax or the high points of the story. We also looked at a plot roller coaster, and when most children see the roller coaster, they see the climax at the top. And although the climax is the high point of the story, a common misconception is that it's usually in the middle. The climax, however, is usually toward the end with the rising action. After the rising action is the climax, and then there's the falling action and the resolution. The falling action and the resolution, the climax usually falls in between. But that's a common misconception that kids have, because the truth is, the climax is the highest point of the story. We also looked at characteristics of tall tales, such as characters with special abilities, settings, and plot. But one of the characteristics that we often find with traditional tales is the theme. Pay close attention to the main character, along with interactions and changes, and the conflicts, as well as how they are resolved. Always ask yourself, what is the high point of the story? What events led to that rising action? How do the characters switch or change? Do they learn? Do they grow? But just remember, there's always a lesson learned by the character. And if you can recall from last week, we created a traditional tales anchor chart that shows the whole umbrella of different types of stories that one might see with the traditional tale. Remember, a traditional tale is a story in written or oral form that was passed down throughout history. You may see fables, legends, tall tales, folk tales, myths, and fairy tales. They all fall under the traditional tale umbrella. Today, our story will be a fairy tale. Before we get into specifics with the story, let's look at our academic vocabulary. We have the word theme. Remember, a theme is a universal idea presented in a text that speaks to common human experience. Plot, a story's organizational structure. Plot. We have the rising action. This is where the suspense, tension, conflict is required in all stories. This is where the suspense and the tension starts building in all stories. Climax, the decisive point of which the reader knows how the conflict will be resolved. Climax. The falling action, where the consequences of how the conflict was addressed or played out. The falling action. We also have resolution, where the suspense or tension conflict required in all stories. The resolution is basically how the main character solves the problem. Imagery, the creation of mental images throughout language. And infer, to arrive at a conclusion, a generalization, or prediction based on the examination of various details and pieces of information. Now, we're going to see sentence stems such as the interaction between the characters suggests that. The interaction between the characters suggests that what? The author wrote this selection most likely to. We always want to consider the author's purpose. Based on the selection, the reader can conclude that. We always want to think about what can we conclude. What is an important message presented in the story? What is an important message? Remember, a theme is a lesson or message in the story. There's always sensory language. The sensory language, the sensory language in the text helps the reader understand. Paragraph blank is important to the plot because we always want to think of these things. We also want to think about the characters, how they reveal who they are, and how they change. Speaking of theme, a theme is the message or lesson or the moral of the story. The theme is the lesson or moral of the story. Girls and boys, sometimes the theme is stated and sometimes the theme is implied. On our theme board, we have stated. Sometimes themes are stated or told to you by an author. A lot of fairy tales will have a moral or lesson at the end. When the theme is stated directly by the author, we don't have to look very far. It's there. But most of the time, the theme is implied. This means that you, the reader, would have to think about the story. It can be tricky, but if you think about all of the different strategies that we use in understanding characters, their behaviors, their interactions, and their changes, it's important to find the theme. And it's easier. And we must also think about the big idea or lesson the author wants you to take away. Last week, we looked at a main character, the interactions and changes, and we realized that this was the key to helping us find the theme. Later on, we're going to look at the keys of finding the theme to see if whether or not our prediction is supported by the facts. Before I go into the story, I want to expose you to the academic vocabulary. I'm sorry, we've already discussed the academic vocabulary. Let's talk about the critical vocabulary. You'll see the word dullard. When I saw this word dullard, I was thinking to myself, I see dull. So what is dullard? A dullard is a person who is viewed as not being very smart. A dullard is a person who is viewed as not being very smart. Inhabitant. Can you say it? Inhabitant. An inhabitant is a person or animal that lives or occupies a place. An inhabitant. And finally, we have the word pucket. Pucket. A pucket is a young hen. A pucket is a young hen. And now to our story. The name of this story is Jack the Dullard, an old story told anew by Hans Christian Andersen. This story was written in 1855. Remember, fairy tales and other forms of traditional tales, many of them were written hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So the language might be a little different, but that's okay. We will read and we will infer as we do. Far in the interior of the country lay an old baronial hall, and in it lived an old proprietor who had two sons, which two young men thought themselves too clever by half. They wanted to go out and woo the king's daughter, for the maiden in question had publicly announced that she would choose for her husband that youth who could arrange his words best. So again, we had two young men who wanted to marry a princess. And she announced that she would choose for her husband that youth who could arrange his words best. So these two geniuses prepared themselves a full week for the wooing. This was the longest time that could be granted them, but it was enough, for they had had much preparatory information, and everybody knows how useful that is. One of them knew the whole Latin dictionary by heart, and 3 whole years of the daily paper of the little town into the bargain, and so well indeed that he could repeat it all either backwards or forwards, just as he chose. The other was deeply read in the corporation law, and knew by heart what every corporation ought to know. And accordingly, he thought he could talk of affairs of state and put his spoke in the wheel in the council. And he knew one thing more. He could embroider suspenders with roses and other flowers, and with arabesques, for he was a tasty, light-fingered fellow. So do you see how the exposition gives us all of the background information before we go into the heart of the story? I shall win the princess, so cried both of them. Therefore, their old papa gave to each of them a handsome horse. The youth who knew the dictionary and newspaper by heart had a black horse, and he who knew all about the corporation law received a milk white steed. Then they rubbed the corners of their mouths with fish oil, so that they might become very smooth and glib. All the servants stood below in the courtyard and looked on while they mounted their horses. And just by chance, a third son came up. For the proprietor had really 3 sons, though nobody counted the third with his brothers, because he was not so learned as they, and indeed he was generally known as Jack the Dullard. Let's think about that for a moment. Nobody counted the third with his brothers. He was not so learned. In other words, he didn't know as much as his brothers knew in terms of academics, and he wasn't counted. What does this reveal about the real character of the brothers if they didn't consider their own brother to be their brother? If arrogant comes to mind, you are correct. Father dear, asked Jack. I must have a horse too. I do feel so desperately inclined to marry. If she accepts me, she accepts me. And if she won't have me, I'll have her. But she shall be mine. Don't talk nonsense, replied the old gentleman. You should have no horse from me. You don't know how to speak. You can't arrange your words. Your brothers are very different fellows from you. Well, quoth Jack the dullard, if I can't have a horse, I'll take the billy goat who belongs to me, and he can carry me very well. And so said, so done. He mounted the billy goat, pressed his heels into its sides, and galloped down the high street like a hurricane. Think about the author's use of sensory language when he said, Jack galloped along like a hurricane. What does that help us visualize? We think about the literal meaning of a hurricane. Hurricanes are unpredictable, very fast, and who knows which way they're going. So we could only imagine how quickly and unpredicted Jack's steps were. Hello, shouted Jack the dillard. Here am I. Look what I have found on the high road. And he showed them what it was, and it was a dead crow. Dullard, exclaimed the brothers, what are you going to do with that? With the crow? Why, I am going to give it to the princess. Yes, do so. They said as they laughed and rode on. Hello, here I am again. Just see what I have found now. You don't find that on the high road every day. And the brothers turned round to see what he could have found now. Dillard, they cried, that is only an old wooden shoe, and the upper part is missing into the bargain. Are you going to give that also to the princess? Most certainly I shall, replied Jack the dullard. And again the brothers laughed and rode on, and thus they got far in advance of him. But, hello, hop, and there was Jack the dullard again. It is getting better and better, he cried. Hooray, it is quite famous. Why, what have you found this time? Inquired the brothers. Oh, said Jack the dullard, I can hardly tell you how glad the princess will be. Bah, said the brothers, that is nothing but clay out of the ditch. Yes, certainly it is, said Jack the dullard, and clay of the finest sort. See, it is so wet it runs through one's fingers, and he filled his pocket with the clay. By now, it should be getting clear that this is the rising action. They're on their way to the palace. They're not there yet, but it keeps getting interesting more and more as we read. But his brothers galloped on till the sparks flew, and consequently they arrived a full hour earlier at the town gate than Jack did. Now at the gate, each suitor was provided with a number, and all were placed in rows immediately on their arrival, 6 in each row, and so closely packed together that they could not move their arms. And that was a prudent arrangement, for they would certainly have come to blows had they been able merely because one of them stood before the other. All the inhabitants of the country round about stood in great crowds around the castle, almost under the very windows, to see the princess receive the suitors, and as such stepped into the hall, his power of speech seemed to desert him, like the light of a candle that is blown out. Look at that figurative language. As each stepped into the hall, we're talking about the suitors, his power of speech seemed to desert him, like the light of a candle that has blown out. Then the princess would say, "He is of no use. Away with him, out of the hall." At last the turn came for the brother who knew the dictionary by heart. But he did not know it now. He had absolutely forgotten it altogether, and the board seemed to re-echo with his footsteps, and the ceilings of the hall was made of looking glass, so that he saw himself standing on his head, and at the window stood 3 clerks and a head clerk, and every one of them was writing down every single word that was uttered, so that it might be printed in the newspapers and sold for a penny at the street corners. It was a terrible ordeal, and they had, moreover, made such a fire in the stove that the room seemed quite red hot. "It is dreadfully hot here," observed the first brother. "Yes," replied the princess, "my father is going to roast young pullets today." Remember, those are young hens. "Yes," replied the princess. Bah! There he stood like a baa lamb. Bah! He had not been prepared for a speech of this kind, and had not a word to say. Though he intended to say something, he could only get out, "Bah, bah, bah." "He is of no use," said the princess. "Away with him." "It is terribly warm," he observed. "Yes, we're roasting pullets today," replied the princess. Now she's talking to the second brother. "Would you please, stammered he, and all the clerks wrote down, "He is of no use," said the princess. "Away with him." Now came the turn of Jack the dullard. He rode into the hall on his goat. "Well, it's most abominably hot in here." "Yes, because I'm roasting young pellets," replied the princess. "Ah, that's tricky," exclaimed Jack the dullard, "for I suppose you'll let me roast my crow at the same time." "With the greatest pleasure," said the princess, "but have you anything you can roast it in? For I have neither a pot nor pan." "Certainly I have," said Jack. "Here's a cooking utensil with a handle." And he brought out the old wooden shoe and put the crow in it. It had a tin handle. "Well, that is a famous dish," said the princess. "But what shall we do for sauce?" "Oh, I have that in my pocket," said Jack. "I have so much of it that I can afford to throw some away." And he poured some of the clay out of his pocket. "I like that," said the princess. "You can give an answer, and you have something to say for yourself, and so you shall be my husband." "But are you aware that every word we speak is being taken down and will be published in the paper tomorrow? Look yonder, and you will see in every window 3 clerks and a head clerk, and the old head clerk is the worst of all, for he can't understand anything. But she only said this to frighten Jack the dullard, and the clerks gave a great crow of delight, and each one spurted a blot of his pen on the floor. "Oh, those are the gentlemen, are they?" said Jack. "Then I will give them the best I have." And he turned out his pocket and flung the wet clay full in the head clerk's face. "That was very cleverly done," observed the princess. "I could not have done that, but I shall learn in time." And accordingly, Jack the dullard was made a king, and received a crown, and received a castle, and received a wife, and sat upon his throne. And this report we have wet from the press of the head clerk and the corporation of the printers. Wasn't that a lovely story? We can learn many lessons from it. So let's go back to our thinking job in terms of theme. I would like to share with you the keys. Just like our key, here are 3 keys that would help us unlock the mystery of the theme. Characters' conflict, how the conflict is resolved, and the lesson learned by the character. Let's think about those elements. Characters' conflict. The main conflict was everyone wanted to marry the queen. But for Jack was not respected. They considered him to be not very smart. Not only that, he wasn't equipped with what he needed or what they thought he needed. How was the conflict resolved? Jack the dullard continued, and he did not give up. Lesson learned by the character. That's the final part of theme. Let's go back to our theme board. So for you, I have read this story in advance. I want you to first think about, what do you think the theme of the story is? Remember, there could be multiple themes within a story. And in this case, we do have multiple themes. Okay? Now that you've considered it, here are some common things that I saw in the story. Talent can take you places, but hard work can keep you there. Talent can take you places, but hard work can keep you there. Yes, the brothers did have talent, but unfortunately, when put on the spot and having to talk to the princess, their talent went out the window. However, Jack, he worked hard. Along the way, he found things to provide to the princess. And guess what? He never gave up in trying to woo the princess. Here's another big theme or idea from the story. It is better to give than receive. It is better to give than receive. This is also true. The other brothers, they thought their talent was enough, but they didn't stop at one time to try to bring a gift, bear a gift to the princess. Jack did the shoe, the crow, and the clay. So for Jack, he wasn't thinking of himself. He was of the idea that it is better to give than receive. Here's another theme. Remember, one story can have multiple themes. Dare to be different and believe in yourself. Dare to be different and believe in yourself. We placed that on our theme board. Jack was different, and he believed in himself. Who cares if his dad didn't buy him a horse? Who cares if he didn't have the finest of clothes? Who cares if he wasn't the best spoken person? Dare to be different. He was different. And as we can see, his differences is what set him apart from the other suitors. Two more. Never judge a book by its cover. We should never do that. And in this story, the princess did not judge Jack by his clothing. She didn't judge the others by their clothing either, because although they may have been in the best clothes and they may have had the best horse, it wasn't what she was looking for. And then finally for our theme board, don't let setbacks stop you. Don't let setbacks stop you. That is another theme. Jack had many setbacks in the story. He had a late start. He didn't find out till the last minute. And in fact, his brothers, and I'm sure most of the other suitors, they had time to practice and practice and practice. Jack, the dullard, had major setbacks, but it did not deter him or stop him from achieving his goal. So when I look at all of them, which is what you should do as a reader, dare to be different and believe in yourself. Never judge a book by its cover. Talent can take you places, but hard work can keep you there. Don't let setbacks stop you. It is better to give than to receive. Yes, these are all messages in the story. But for me, I would have to say, dare to be different and believe in yourself. Because Jack was different, he did not let his differences stop him. In fact, his differences are what made the princess like him even more. Here's your exit ticket for today. As we remember the keys to unlocking traditional tales, I want you to grab a book, any fiction book, any traditional tale that you can find. Ask yourself, what's the character's conflict? How the conflict was resolved? And lesson learned by the character. Then when you take these 3 keys, you determine the theme or the lesson of the story. Remember, an author's purpose with traditional tales is to entertain. Be entertained with a good book. And always remember what I tell you. What do good readers do? A great way to understand, help me finish it, please. A great way to understand what we read and write better is to read like writers. You guessed it. Bye-bye.